Thank you, sir. I would like to request I would like to request Dr. Arun Garg, Dr. Sanjay Saxena, and Dr. Ashish Sahni to take over the session of neuroimmunology. I invite Dr. Arun Garg, Dr. Sanjay Saxena, and Dr. Ashish Sahni as chairpersons for the next session of neuroimmunology.
So, hello everyone. So it's been an exhaustive session, a lot of learning, a lot of economics, a lot of globalization, a lot of things were discussed right now. Eye opener, and I hope our fight with the COVID is gleefully partially over, and we'll be able to overcome that. So, without wasting any further time, I invite Dr. Neerja Chaudhary to start the proceeding with the first talk. She's the professor. Everybody knows that she is the professor of neurology at Safdarjung Hospital. So, Dr. Neera, all yours now.
Sanjay, Dr. Neera Chaudhary.
Oh, Dr. Neera Chaudhary, yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
There's something come. Okay. At the outset, I would like to thank the organizers, Dr. Padma and Dr. Achal Srivastava, for giving me this opportunity. So I've been allotted this topic of atypical optic neuritis, management issues and concerns. So before that, we would like to see what is optic neuritis. So optic neuritis is an inflammatory optic neuropathy affecting one or both optic nerves. Typical or the demyelinating optic neuritis may be associated with multiple sclerosis and is the most common type of optic neuritis seen in the West. However, here we come across a lot of atypical optic neuritis cases which could result from an inflammatory, infectious, or autoimmune disorder. Differentiating the two types of optic neuritis is paramount and may be challenging early on in the clinical course. The recent identification of specific autoantibodies associated with the central nervous system inflammatory disorders has provided novel insights into the immune targets and mechanisms that impact the prognosis, treatment, and recurrence of optic neuritis. Hence, the neurologists and the ophthalmologists should be aware of the clinical, laboratory, and imaging findings that may provide important clues to the etiology of optic neuritis and the potential need for aggressive management for an implementation of clinical care, which is optimized in terms of short-term as well as long-term therapeutic outcomes, minimizing injury, improving recovery, and preventing future vision loss. So the typical optic neuritis, we are all aware, affects the young women, usually unilateral. There are painful eye movements. Pain with eye movement is often preceded by the onset of vision loss, the visual field loss, dyschromatopsia, decreased contrast sensitivity. And this data is from the large ONTT trial, and the fundus examination is usually normal in the typical cases. And only 35% of the patients may have papillitis, and this edema, when present, is very mild. The visual acuity and the visual field usually recover within a few months. Intravenous corticosteroids hasten the visual recovery. Long-term visual outcomes are favorable even without treatment. Its association with MS, we are all aware. Now, coming on to the atypical optic neuritis is a heterogeneous collection of disorders whose presenting features suggest inflammation of the optic nerve, and this could be triggered by an inflammatory or an immune-related disease like neuromyelitis optica, anti-MOG, neurosarcoidosis, infections like syphilis. So the list of infections that causes the presentation like that of atypical optic neuritis is syphilis, tuberculosis, Lyme's, Bartonella, HIV, hepatitis. In the antibody-mediated, we have NMOSD, MOG, NMDA, GFAP, these various systemic immune-mediated disorders and lymphoproliferative conditions like lymphomas, leukemias, and also neurotoxic treatments, post-bone marrow transplant, reconstitution syndrome, and opportunistic infections. Now, what is the atypicality? Male gender, age less than 18 years or greater than 50, absence of periocular pain, bilaterality, a marked vision loss, a vision loss that progresses past 2 weeks, vision that does not improve either with steroids or spontaneously. On examination, we have uveitis, severe swelling, peripapillary hemorrhages, macular exudates. The atypical radiographic features are extensive involvement of the optic nerve, sheath predominant enhancement, enhancement of the optic chiasm, optic tract, and the various autoantibodies may be associated. This was a 30-year-old lady who presented with first episode of unilateral painless visual loss in one eye upon awakening. Was diagnosed as Crohn's disease 18 months back, but was not on medication. The vision was 6/36 on the right and 6/9 on the left. There was right RAPD, reduction in color vision, a large, dense unilateral nasal scotoma, gross swelling of the optic nerve head on the right and swelling of the left optic nerve head. It was bilateral vitritis. MRI brain was normal. Who started on steroids, improved, but with a residual dense nasal field defect and a central visual acuity of 6/9. So this is an atypical optic neuritis, which could be associated with Crohn's. The bilateral uveitis pointed towards the Crohn's disease. And the atypical features were the absence of pain, gross optic nerve head swelling, and the bilateral disease. Then various infections. When do we suspect that the optic neuritis has been caused by an infection? When there is presence of uveitis, retinitis, chororetinitis, ocular inflammation, optic nerve granulomas are seen, or there is severe disc edema. We should all raise the concern that we're probably dealing with an infection. And these agents could be involving the nerve as a direct invasion, or it could be because of the inflammatory process, degenerative or vascular phenomenon, and an associated meningitis would have it. And so the various infections that are important to be considered whenever we are having optic neuritis and there is uveitis, chororetinitis, is syphilis, Bartonella, Lyme's, tuberculosis, viral, and the treatments would be specific to that infective agent. Then there's a long list of inflammatory conditions. Sarcoidosis is one, multisystem disorder, we are all aware. There's also associated ocular inflammation, cranial neuropathies, meningeal granulomas, endocrinopathies. The ACE levels are not so helpful. And sometimes the biopsy is also not yielding. Then one could have paraneoplastic presentation of an atypical optic neuritis. And again, there is prominent disc edema, vitreous cells, retinal vascular cells. And the one that is associated is the CRMP5 IgG. The differential diagnosis of this should always be entertained when there is a bilateral vision loss, the subacute optic neuritis. Now, this was a 21-year-old man who presented with bilateral painful visual reduction over 2 weeks, 6/24 in the right eye and 6/60 in the left, associated with reduced color vision. Both optic nerve heads were swollen. There was significant optic nerve edema. Visual acuity returned rapidly on high-dose steroids, but there was worsening again on tapering the steroids. Long-term immunosuppression was required. Investigations revealed optic nerve enhancement with contrast within the nerve sheath. CT chest, there was hilar lymphadenopathy, was diagnosed as systemic sarcoidosis after bronchoscopy and exclusion of tuberculosis. Atypical features were bilaterality, presence of apparent neuroretinitis, as well as optic neuritis, and recurrence of optic neuritis when the steroids were reduced. And there is autoimmune, other conditions we are aware of optic neuritis being associated with 4 IgG, MOG IgG, and the glial fibrillary acid protein IgG. So the GFAP optic neuritis antibodies are seen, and they may be restricted to the spinal fluid. Associated antibodies may be the NMDA or the glutamic acid or decarboxylase, and they may be present in the serum and the CSF. CSF pleocytosis may also be seen. And a typical pattern on the brain MRI may be linear perivascular radial enhancement extending outward from the ventricles. NMOSD, we are all aware, we've seen a lot of cases that there is involvement of the optic nerve, more than half of the length of the optic nerve, there's involvement of the optic chiasm, and then the other areas of the brain that are involved, area prostrema, diencephalic lesions, and longitudinally extensive transverse myelitis. MOG IgG optic neuritis has a higher likelihood of being recurrent, bilateral, associated with disc edema, perineural enhancement around the optic nerve on the MRI, and it is severe at the nadir, but the recovery after treatment is good. But the hallmark is the recurrences. It recurs very frequently, and the ultimate damage would be the same as seen in aquaporin IgG4. So it is very important to identify these conditions so that one can give a targeted immunotherapy. And it's important to differentiate between the optic neuritis of multiple sclerosis, aquaporin 4 IgG. Also very important to understand is that the drugs that may be helpful for multiple sclerosis, preventing recurrences, may worsen or may lead to recurrences in NMOSD as well as anti-MOG. Now, investigations would be according to the list of causes that I've already enumerated. And coming on to VEP now. Now, there's a difference in the VEP presentation of in MS as well as in NMOSD. In MS, we will have a P100 latency that is prolonged, and one may see a subclinical involvement also being reflected in the VEP findings. However, in NMOSD, it has been seen that because it is an axonal loss, there's an amplitude that is effective, and usually the unaffected eye will show a normal VEP. There will not be a subclinical pattern seen in the VEP. Coming on to the OCT, very important. We have these retinal nerve fiber layer, the ganglion cell inner plexiform layer, which become thin. But what happens initially is, because of the swelling, the retinal nerve fiber layer, there is a lot of edema and the thinning may not be seen. It is a ganglion cell inner plexiform layer whose thickness can be assessed right from the beginning, and that may be a better way of looking at a longitudinal case and what eventually happens to these nerve fiber layers. Now, there's also a difference in the OCT finding on NMO. Here, there's severe neuroaxonal loss. There is a diffuse thinning of the retinal nerve fiber layer as well as the ganglion cell inner plexiform layer. There is thickening of the microcystic of the inner nuclear layer because of microcysts and stronger inflammatory response. In MS, the involvement on OCT is patchy and it's temporary. Looking at various antibodies, the aquaporin 4 MOG, we are all aware that the oligoclonal bands, they're positive in 20 to 30% patients of NMO, 6 to 13% of MOG, and a larger number of cases of MS. The other antibodies that can be looked at is the glycine receptor antibody, which is seen in relapsing optic neuritis, the GFAPs, indicative of a very inflammatory process, then interleukin 6 and the interleukin 6 receptor. They are increased in NMO, neurofilament light protein, high levels seen in patients with incomplete remission of optic neuritis, and TH17 and TREG17 and TH17. There's an imbalance ratio in atypical neuritis than in the typical neuritis. Just a word about the oligoclonal bands. There is a lipid-specific oligoclonal IgM bands, which are considered a marker of highly inflammatory MS with a shorter time to second relapse and a worse disease prognosis. Now, therapeutic issues and modalities. Now, the question is, we all know that for acute treatment, steroids are given. Are steroids enough for these cases of atypical optic neuritis? Despite the extensive clinical data supporting the benefits and safety of high-dose steroids, administration for acute optic neuritis is unclear whether early treatment with high-dose corticosteroids is optimal for all cases of optic neuritis, whether other treatments should be substituted or combined with corticosteroids to improve the visual outcome. When serum samples of 177 of 448 patients enrolled in the ONTT were assayed for aquaporin 4 and MOG, only 4 MOG IgG seropositive patients were identified. Therefore, the results of ONTT are not informative on the impact of high-dose corticosteroids on visual recovery in NMO and MOG. The retrospective analysis of treatment responses in NMO attacks indicated the therapeutic benefit from intravenous steroids is often incomplete. Repeated administration does not improve the rate of complete remission. Among 232 isolated NMO-SD optic neuritis attacks, only 77 patients, that is 3%, showed complete remission after treatment with high-dose intravenous steroids. Repeat courses did not increase the number of complete responders, but only reduced the number of non-responders. Response rates were even more discouraging when there was an associated myelitis. In MOG and the GFAP, again, the steroid response is very good, but the recurrence is very high. So important to identify these conditions. Now, the other therapeutic modalities in experimental rat models, IVIG was used. It remained to be determined whether IVIG may benefit patients with NMO-SD when delivered in conjunction or after a round of high-dose corticosteroids. Moving on to the plasma exchange, it has been used successfully in treatment of steroid refractive optic neuritis and NMO disorders. Depending on the study, improvement in visual function has been noted in 45 to 50% of treated patients.
Sorry to interfere.
Unfortunately, due to the retrospective design, their investigations failed to define the criteria for the optimal use of or timing of the plasma exchange. In many instances, short interval between the completion of the IV steroids and institution of plasma exchange makes it unclear how much clinical benefit is due to the delayed effect of the IV steroid.
Dr.
Neera, may I
6,
request you to
lower
wind up, please?
baseline disability, rapid initiation of treatment, and shorter relapse duration have been associated with greater response to plasma exchange.
Dr. Neera?
Although early initiation of plasma exchange correlates with treatment response, delayed plasma exchange therapy may still be a reasonable treatment option for patients with acute optic neuritis who may not have immediate access to facilities with necessary equipment. In the study, Dechamps et al. Found that the half of the patients with poor visual recovery, visual acuity worse than 20 by 200, after high-dose IV steroids improved to visual acuity of 20 by 30 or better after plasma exchange, and the mean time to plasma exchange was 30 days. Because plasma exchange incurs significant costs, may result in serious side effects such as hypotension, infection, hypocalcemia, coagulopathy. A randomized prospective study of plasma exchange versus IV steroids for the treatment of acute NMOSD and other autoimmune conditions leading to optic neuritis needs to be done. An alternative form of therapeutic apheresis that allows for selective removal of, hello, am I heard?
Yes, Dr.
Yeah,
Neera, can you wind up?
Form of therapeutic apheresis that allows for selective removal of antibodies from plasma using modified membranes. Therapeutic apheresis offers the potential advantage of removing pathogenic autoantibodies while sparing other plasma proteins. The immunoabsorption has been reported to benefit steroid-refractory optic neuritis. The relative efficacy and safety of plasma exchange and immunoabsorption are yet to be evaluated.
Your time is up, Dr. Neera.
Anji, sir,
That's almost.
am I heard?
Yes, yes, being heard.
So Dr. Achal was calling actually.
So can you hear?
So patients who do not respond to IV steroids or plasma exchange, intravenous cyclophosphamide immunosuppression may represent a final resort. Neuromyelitis optica study group has considered using azathioprine, rituximab.
Can you hear, Dr. Neera?
Anji, sir.
I thought we are short of time. We are about to start the inaugural ceremony. So please wind up.
Intravenous cyclophosphamide immunosuppression, neuromyelitis optica study group has considered using azathioprine, rituximab for long-term immunosuppression as the first-line agent. A multicenter trial found rituximab decreased relapse rate and improved disability score after 2 years. Mycophenol, mofetil, methotrexate, mitoxantrone can be used as a second-line therapy. There are no FDA-approved drugs that are considered rituximab, inebilizumab. And for paraneoplastic CRMP, the use of intravitreal triamcinolone may be worthwhile. Differentiating, as I've already said, NMOSD from MS as well as MOG is important because worsening disease has been reported after treatment with several approved MS therapies like beta-interferon, natalizumab, dimethyl fumarate, alemtuzumab, and fingolimod. Now for MOG, we have this flow chart, which is very good, that we give steroids and we have to then give them orally also after IV and then taper them over 1 to 3 months. If severe and no significant improvement at 1 to 2 weeks, consider plasma exchange or IVIG. If there's a single attack, full recovery, observe. If there are recurrent attacks or steroid-dependent incomplete recovery, then strongly recommend chronic immunotherapy after more than 2 or equal to 2 attacks with incomplete recovery. Consider immunotherapy like mycophenolate, azathioprine, and IVIG. Other drugs are experimental. Some have been found to be having a good clinical outcome in phase 2 trials is erythropoietin. Phenytoin did not have any clinical equation, though in experiments antibody against LINGO-1. And opicinumab is also being tried, and various mixed results are there. Some showing an improvement in the VEP latency, and in other studies it is not. And STK226 is a secretome of amnion-derived multipotent progenitor cell containing multiple growth factors and anti-inflammatory cytokines, and it is shown to decrease the vascular permeability, immune cell infiltration, edema, and accelerates the wound healing. So the dilemma, now when we have a seropositive case, it becomes easy, but if it's a seronegative case, we got to correlate our clinical laboratory imaging data and then decide on the appropriate management, whether we need just steroids or we need to be ready for giving plasma exchange, whether long-term therapy is required. So the treatment rationale for optic neuritis would be incomplete without considering the potential for recurrent vision loss. As optic neuritis is routinely associated with the retinal nerve fiber layer and the ganglion cell inner plexiform layer loss, the ideal method for optimizing long-term visual outcome is prevention of treatment, particularly with NMOSD and MOG. So acute optic neuritis is caused by increasingly complex number of disorders. Our clinical, radiological, other laboratory data needs to be correlated, seropositive case or seronegative, and go ahead with the appropriate line of management and prospective treatment trials designed to investigate aggressive treatment regime in acute inflammatory optic neuritis are likely to support novel treatment rationales that accelerate recovery and preserve visual function and structural competence of the optic nerve. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Neera. So the wait is getting a little longer because we are waiting for the inaugural ceremony as intimated to me by the organizers. So I think we will have. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back after the grand opening ceremony, which was virtual, but it was very well organized. And I think we were there as if we were physically there and felt each and every moment of that ceremony. So without keeping you waiting for any further, I invite Professor Mehndi, who I think everybody knows all over the globe that he's one of the pioneer neurologists from India. And I think without wasting any further time, because he is a very strong crime manager, now it is Professor Mehndi to take us ahead for the next 15 minutes to enlighten us on the rare antibody-mediated neuropathies which we encounter in the clinical practice.
Thank you so much, Honorable Chairperson, for the kind invitation. At the outset, I'd like to express my gratitude to Dr. Padma Srivastava, as well as Dr. Achal, and my colleague, Dr. Devashish, Dr. Amitabh Verma, and all EC members of DNA for inviting me to give this talk. I bring greetings from BL Kapoor, Max Healthcare. I slightly changed the topic because I thought it should not be rare. It's uncommon antibodies in peripheral neuropathies. We invariably don't suspect it. That's the reason of often misdiagnosis. So I thought, why did Achal invite me? These are two Cochrane reviews which I have written, where I was first author, then I asked him to be the first author. And there's another which we have done together. I have no conflict of interest while giving this talk. Now, plan of my talk, the chairperson is my dear friend, but very strict with me, Dr. Sanjay Saxena. So I'll try to finish in 13 minutes, Sanjay. I will talk on what is highlighted: monoclonal gammopathies and anti-MAG antibodies, under immune-mediated neuropathies, neuropathy associated with anti-ganglioside antibodies, paraneoplastic neuropathies, and anti-neuronal antibodies. If time permits, newer antibodies in immune-mediated. Take-home message: quiz time will not permit. I have prepared 5 questions. Time will not permit. The saddest thing about betrayal is that it never comes from your enemies. It comes from within. That means it's a molecular mimicry. We say autoantibodies. We don't say non-auto antibodies. So it comes from within, and this is the auto mimicry. Now, introduction. Again, I will just read highlight the point. The annual incidence of immune-mediated neuropathy is reported to be 1.2 to 2.3 per 100,000 population. This is as per the epidemiological study done by Lund in UK. It is not the pain, it is who it comes from. That's the neuropathic pain, which is very troublesome, with which the patient comes. Then later patient will come with the negative symptoms of motor and sensory issues. Now, peripheral nervous system antigenic targets for autoantibodies, potential antigenic targets, extracellular, intracellular. Extracellular are PNS axonal membrane, PNS myelin. It won't be possible to read all this is being recorded live, and if one needs, I can share these slides. But intracellular, tubulin, WHO antigen, we often say WHO antibodies, CV2, CRMP5, Dr. Neera did mention about this, and Casper2. Now, pathophysiological neuropathy, we often talk of axonal demyelination mixed, but the time is changing. Now we talk of nodoparanodopathy, and such nodoparanodopathy are strongly associated with the presence of serum anti-ganglioside antibodies. Now, immune-mediated neuropathy, that was the introduction for 1.5 minutes. Now, immune-mediated neuropathies are neuropathy associated with monoclonal gammopathy, the most commonest type. Neuropathy associated with anti-ganglioside antibodies, paraneoplastic syndromes, and antineural antibody, we know of subacute cerebellar ataxia in elderly. Vasculitis-related neuropathy, drug-induced neuropathy can also be immune-mediated neuropathies. Now, monoclonal gammopathies and neuropathy, let us see. I'll read only some compound. Anti-myelin-associated glycoprotein, MAG antibodies. So these are the IgM antibodies to cause demyelination, was first shown in 1987. Now these are HNK epitope is also present in other peripheral nerve glycoproteins, including P0, PMP22, we often talk about this in the CSF, and phosphocan and 2 peripheral nerve glycopeptide. I will stop here and then go to the next slide because the time is short. Now monoclonal gammopathies, you are aware of many monoclonal gammopathies of undetermined significance, which is also called MUCs. Around 10% of patients with neuropathy of unknown cause have a monoclonal protein. You have to get it done, where it's not easily explainable. Now, this was one in 2004, I reported a case, IgA monoclonal gammopathy of undetermined significance with peripheral neuropathy. This gentleman primarily came with very marked sensory loss, was not explainable by CIDP or other causes, and we did this, and it was MGUS, which was IgA. With IgA, it is uncommon. Normally, we say IgM. Now, disease and comments. You can read only the component which are important, like monoclonal gammopathy of undetermined significance can be from pre-malignant plasma, cell disorder, IgM, non-IgM or light chain, Waldenstrom, macroglobulinemia, or AL amyloidosis. Immune-mediated neuropathy with antibody against targeting myelin-associated glycoprotein. I know we are towards the fag end of the day. I don't want you to feel trapped. Waldenstrom macroglobulinemia, myeloma, immunoglobulin light chain, amyloidosis. So I'll just see the category, or what we say, categorical variables rather than going in all nitty-gritty. POEMS syndrome. We often say, oh, hypertrichosis, endocrinopathy, lymphadenopathy, pleural effusion, we should think of POEMS. So this is like polyneuropathy, organomegaly, endocrinopathy, M protein, skin changes. The treatment of POEMS include local radiculopathy, if it is osteosclerotic myeloma, chemotherapy, and autologous stem cell transplantation these days. Other treatment include monoclonal antibodies, etc. And also role of thalidomide, coming back in many neurological diseases. Distal acquired demyelinating symmetrical neuropathy, again, some people consider can be a variant of CIDP, but often associated with IgM monoclonal gammopathy. And approximately 50% of patients have this. Like I said, our patient was nothing but IgA DATs. Now, associated with anti-ganglioside antibodies, these are like lipid bilayer by a ceramide moiety and exposed to the extracellular space. These are extracellular. I will come to tubulin WHO later. And also the sulfatide component, which is on the wall of the myelin sheath. So Aman variant of GBS may occur because of this. Then acute neuropathies associated with again, I will just say categories, can't name all the gangliosides, is like in Chinese variant, like Campylobacter jejunum, MSAN variant with GM1, GD1A. Miller-Fisher, most very often we discuss about this. Commonest is GQ1B. Bickerstaff brainstem variants, again GQ1B. Then acute ataxic neuropathy, acute sensory ataxic neuropathy, GD1B. Acute ophthalmoparesis and pharyngocervical brachial, which is a restricted type of GBS, GT1A. Now, molecular mimicry, as I said, the enemy is within. In GBS, we very well talk of molecular mimicry. Now, chronic neuropathy is associated like multifocal motor neuropathy, chronic axonal ophthalmoplegia, neuropathy, ophthalmoplegia, IgM paraproteinemia, and disilocil antibodies, CONMAT, and Canda syndrome. CIDP is well known, but there are, for sensory, there are different ganglioside anti-NF155. Gait ataxia with late onset polyneuropathy called GALOP, and the agent here is galopin. Now, paraneoplastic syndromes, these four I will mention. Anti-WHO, small cell lung carcinoma. Anti-CV2-CRMP2 adenocarcinoma breast. Anti-Casper contactin-associated protein like 2. Anti-MAG IgM. Paraneoplastic syndrome, they can present with motor, sensory neuropathy, or cerebellar ataxia, subacute onset, demyelinating neuropathy, vasculitic, or even neuromyotonia, and other variations. Vasculitic. Vasculitic neuropathy, often we think of, will occur with T-cell mediated neuropathy, result from inflammation of vasa nervorum. Now, this can occur in, again, MGUS, and it will cause local inflammation like in Church-Strauss syndrome, polyarterial nodosa, or microscopic polyangiitis. Now, this is very important. Each neurologist must keep in mind IgG4 related disease and vasculitic neuropathy. Very young patients have got aortic disease, cardiomyopathy, neuropathy as a result of IgG4. This is in fashion, I will say, these days, and one should keep in mind this. This is from Ken Ohayama, clinical pathological features of neuropathy associated with IgG4 related disease. So this is the one in which therapies include cyclophosphamide, IVIG, Plex, and rituximab. I remember one of my colleagues, I will not name for anonymity, in South India, his wife had IgG4 and had very tough time. She had aortic regurgitation. Now, this was symmetrical sensory motor neuropathy, which I reported in allergic, our group reported, allergic angiitis and granulomatosis. That was myself, Dr. Tatke, Dr. Tyagi, and Dr. Anshu Rohtgi in 1997. Drug-induced immunomodulation, this can also be like immune-mediated, like anti-cancer, monoclonal antibodies against CTLA antigen, etc. First step should be to stop the offending agent, and then, if required, give corticosteroid, IVIG, or plasma exchange. Newer antibodies in immune neuropathy, I think I should finish in time. I have 2 minutes. These are like anti-NF155, I said, CNTN contactin, and Casper and CSP2, which I said, CIDP and in AIDP. Time will not permit to say their classical features which can help to diagnose. Now, therapies for immune-mediated neuropathies are, this is what slide I made around 20 years back. First line corticosteroid, which was considered to be gold standard in CIDP, but now is not a gold standard. Immunosuppressants like cyclophosphamide, azathioprine. Immunophilic like cyclosporin, mycophenolate, mofetil. Immunomodulators, I have put this plasmapheresis, plasma exchange is a better term. High volume, low volume. Immunoglobulins, IVIG, subcutaneous. Monoclonal antibodies. I'll just show the doses. If time permits, these are the one where there are, and monitoring has to be done for blood urea nitrogen and creatinine for IVIG. Plasma exchange, especially blood pressure, fibrinogen, hypocalcemia, etc., because it can cause tetany. And Sanjay will remember one of our patients had tetany in the night at home, and then we got a call. Prednisolone, again, be careful about diabetes, blood pressure, etc. Azathioprine, again, CBC count regularly. Cyclosporin. And then rituximab, reactivation of tuberculosis in our country, JC virus, titer, hepatitis panel, CBC, CD19, CD20. And this is treatment of IgG and IgA paraproteinemia, one very nice review on Cochrane. If those are interested, you can read about this. Now, these were the two reviews which we wrote in Cochrane. Now, multifocal again is IVIG. I have treated only 2 subjects till now, and then there are other monoclonal antibodies. I think I'll go to the take-home messages. A finding of antioganglioside antibodies can be helpful in diagnosis of MMN and CANOMAD. Detection of paraneoplastic antibody may lead to early diagnosis of occult malignancy. Antibody testing should not be a substitute for careful clinical evaluation. First, a good clinical evaluation, not investigation-based evaluation, use of other diagnostic tools or logical thought process, use of natural intelligence, and then comes the artificial intelligence. Thank you very much for the kind attention. Thank you, Chairperson, sir.
So I salute you for sticking to second by second. So I really admire this quality, and you have become little more particular about that. And we are still far away from that, though we have been your student for so many years. But it's fantastic, sir. And we have learned a lot. But I think there are 2 minutes for any comments from that. Anybody has to make any comment? I had just one query, sir. You mentioned about drug-induced immune-mediated neuropathy, and most of these drugs were anti-cancer drugs. So what would be the likely immunology for that? Because they're anti-immunogenic and they're producing...
Yeah, again is like molecular mimicry to either the surface or axon of the nerve and causing neuropathy. That's the only way by which it can cause. Second is it can also lead to further immunosuppression, and there can be opportunistic infection, and that in turn can invite molecular mimicry.
Okay, fine. Thank you so much, sir. So I think we'll move on after an elaborative and very exhaustive talk. Thank you so much, sir. So, but I have my colleague neuropersons also with me. Dr. Sahani, are you there? And let me introduce one of the, next speaker. He is Hamara Bajaj, Dr. B.K. Bajaj. So as we call him fondly. And Dr. Bajaj will start his talk on immune-mediated movement disorders. And after Dr. Sahani is still joined us, I think will also participate with me in the future subsequent talks. So over to you, Dr. Bajaj, please.
Thank you, Dr. Saxena. Good evening, everybody. So I'm sharing my slides. So the movement disorders may be the isolated manifestations of immune-mediated encephalitis, or more often, these may be the prominent and often distinctive manifestations of autoimmune encephalitis. Recognition of these movement disorder presentations are useful in early identification of these encephalitis associated with some of the autoantibody-associated encephalitis. This has great therapeutic implications. The diagnostic criteria have been proposed for autoimmune encephalitis: subacute onset, presence of at least one of the following, like new focal CNS findings, seizures not explained by previously known seizure disorder, CSF pleocytosis, MRI features suggestive of encephalitis, and reasonable exclusion of alternative diagnosis. It is suggested that the immunotherapy be started even before the confirmation of diagnosis by the presence of autoantibodies in appropriate clinical circumstances. Of the new focal CNS findings, movement disorders are prominent component of the immune-mediated autoimmune encephalitis. Movement disorders may be, as I said, isolated presentation, or more often, they are the distinct or prominent manifestation of the encephalitis. So antibodies are the ones, autoantibodies associated with movement disorders may be against the intracellular antigens, or they can be against the extracellular antigens. The ones which are against the intracellular antigen often do not directly cause the clinical presentation. In the encephalitis associated with intracellular autoantibodies, CD8-mediated cytotoxicity is the underlying pathogenic process. On the other hand, extracellular antibodies interactions are they target the intracellular the surface antigens, and they may directly cause the manifestations by affecting the target organ function. Cell surface antigens, as I said, play an important role in the synaptic transmission, plasticity, and excitability. On the other hand, if we see this table, we find that as in the case of cell surface antigen, treatment response is good, but in the case of intracellular cytoplasmic or nuclear antigen antibodies, tumor is more often seen, and the response to the immunotherapy is also relatively poor. So I will come to the individual movement disorders and see how they are associated with the various autoantibodies. So the chorea, one of the chorea may be part of paraneoplastic syndromes in autoantibody like anti-Hu and anti-CRMP5 and a number of others. Anti-Hu antibody, associated encephalitis or the movement disorder, which we see in the form of chorea, is often associated with gastrointestinal pseudo-obstruction, and cerebellar ataxia is often more common. Besides this, there may be other manifestations, and on your right, you see one of the MRI. It's an MRI of a patient who had anti-Hu antibodies and small cell lung carcinoma, as detected by the PET scan. And here we can see in the MRI FLAIR images bilateral mesial temporal hyperintensities. Basal ganglionic structures or other structures which are generally considered to be involved in the movement, in the pathogenesis of movement, may be normal also in such situation. So the other associations which are there in patients presenting with chorea and anti-Hu antibody, and for that matter, rest of the antibodies which I am going to discuss, is important. In the case of anti-CRMP5 mediated paraneoplastic syndrome presenting with chorea, the clues are the hyperintensities on the FLAIR images in the basal ganglionic region, and it is often associated with cognitive decline, neuropathy, optic neuritis, and myelitis. Chorea as a part of paraneoplastic syndrome may also occur in association with anti-PDE-10A, that is anti-phosphodiesterase 10A antibodies. They have a median age of onset of around 70 years, and as in contrast to the anti-Hu and anti-CRMP5, where the females are predominantly affected, here the male and female are equally affected by the disorder. Chorea is more common than Parkinsonism and ataxia, which may also be a manifestation of this autoantibody associated encephalopathy. Hearing loss is another finding, and tumors, usually lungs more than that in renal and pancreatic cancer, are seen. And as I saw, as the picture on the MRI is very similar to the one which I showed previously, wherein the basal ganglionic hyperintensities are seen on MRI. Now coming to the LGI, that is leucine-rich glioma inactivated protein 1 associated disorder. Here the age is somewhere around, the presentation is 60 to 70. The males are more commonly affected, and facial-brachial dystonic seizures are often more common and more as compared to the chorea as a movement disorder. Besides this, other diagnostic clues like hyponatremia is important to look for in such patients. And as is common with many of the encephalitis, there will be mesial temporal lobe hyperintensity on the FLAIR, which is generally indicative of limbic encephalitis. Caspr2 or contactin associated protein like 2, again, the age of presentation is around 50 to 60 years. Here, the males are 8 times more likely to have this disorder as compared to the female, and 20 to 50% of the cases may be associated with thymoma. Besides the chorea, the patient may have myoclonus, ataxia, and very important, peripheral nerve hyperexcitability, which presents as neuromyokemia and myokemia, and this may at times be confused with the chorea also. Another antibody associated with chorea is anti-Iglon, anti-immunoglobulin-like cell adhesion molecule 5. Here, the age of presentation is around 40 to 70 with peak of 60s. Males and females are almost equally affected. The differentiating points are the sleep disorders, which are very different from the usual ones in the sense that it is non-REM parasomnia. Then breathing difficulties is another observation, and the patient may present at times with breathing difficulty, and they may be misdiagnosed till they develop this. The anti-NMDR receptor antibody is, again, it has a wide age of presentation, from 8 months to 85. Female predominance is seen. Most commonly, most other features of encephalopathy, mostly other features of encephalopathies are also there. In younger individuals, it is more likely to be the movement disorder prominent, and in the older individual, it's more of limbic encephalitis. Other antibody like antineurexin 3 alpha may also be associated with dyskinesia as the presentation of encephalopathy related to the antibody. Then another presentation is dystonia and pseudodystonia. Dystonia does not follow pattern of idiopathic dystonia when it is associated with autoimmune encephalopathy. There is no geste antagoniste. Term pseudodystonia is probably more appropriate for some of the dystonic phenomena because of different underlying mechanisms. Dystonia may be associated with anti-Ray antibody. Again, the age of distribution is 47 to 87. Important point is that the patient may present with jaw opening and closing dystonia. Cerebellar ataxia is also most frequent besides other presentations. Other movement disorders may also be seen in this autoantibody disorder. Besides anti-Re, there are a number of others, anti-NMDR, anti-MA2, anti-CRMP5, and all these antibodies may be associated with dystonia in addition to chorea, or as dystonia alone, or pseudodystonia as well. Pseudodystonia, however, is more often seen in the peripheral, or in fact, even in Miller-Fisher syndrome. It may be seen in CIDP with ganglioside, neurofascian, and contactin 1 associated disorders. Stiff person spectrum disorders, the core features of which is abnormal posture, pseudodystonia like lumbar hyperlordosis, foot plantar flexion, and superimposed muscle spasm and excessive startle. These core features may be associated with cerebellar ataxia and focal epilepsy in GAD, anti-GAD antibody disorder, and with the brainstem signs and PERM, that is progressive encephalomyelitis with rigidity and myoclonus. In this PERM, the associated antibodies, anti-glycine receptor antibody, and thymoma is common in this disorder. In another antibody, in anti-DPPX, dipeptidase associated antibody associated disorder, this long-lasting diarrhea can often be the clue to the diagnosis. Sensory ataxia is more seen in anti-amphiphysin or breast and lung cancer. Paroxysmal dyskinesia is seen in anti-LGI1, and faciobrachial dystonic seizures may occur as many times as 100 times in a day, and they are very short lasting. There is just only abnormal posturing of face and arm. They may be easily missed. The side of involvement may alternate, or both the sides may be affected at a time. And if legs are involved, drop attacks may occur. Some may have automatisms, sensory aura, and other features as well. MRI hyperintensities on T1 and T2 weighted sequences are there. Sometimes these findings are not there at all. And as I said in the beginning, anti-LGI1, if you find hyponatremia, then it is another clue in favor of this antibody-associated disorder. Besides this, aquaporin 4, MOG, and anti-NMDR may also present with paroxysmal dyskinesias. Myoclonus is generally not a very distinct manifestation of antibody-associated movement disorders, but in anti-GABA A receptor antibody-associated disorder, prominent myoclonus and intractable seizures or status epilepticus is the presentation. In anti-DPPX, myoclonus is another situation where myoclonus is seen. In rest of the conditions, myoclonus is not prominent, but I must say that in anti-Caspar-2, coarse myoclonus affecting predominantly legs and hampering stance and gait leads to a very difficult and challenging situation about the even diagnosing the phenomenology, underlying phenomenology. The Parkinsonism may be a manifestation of anti-MAR2 paraneoplastic encephalitis. It may present, the patient may present with PSP-like presentation. As I said, there may be prominent sleep disorder, excessive daytime somnolence, RBD, narcolepsy, catalepsy, in addition to other parts of the neuraxis involvement. Here, the thalamic and hypothalamic involvement is prominently seen. Neuronal specific antibodies without underlying malignancy like anti-LGI1, anti-Eglon5 and others may also present with Parkinsonism. Anti-Eglon5 is particularly important because the symptoms of Parkinsonism may develop over years in such patients and the patient may remain undiagnosed for long. The breathing difficulty, as I said earlier, may attract attention to this. So breathing difficulty, sleep disturbance, particularly in the form of non-REM parasomnia, is a clue to the involvement of anti-Eglon5 as a presentation of Parkinsonism. So the patient may present like PSP also, and sometimes even MSA. Corticobasal syndrome-like presentation may also be seen. So it's very important because in this autoimmune disorder, the presentation, the clinical features develop very slowly. So it may be very easily missed and treated as neurodegenerative disorder. So it will be, one needs to pay heed to some of the other associated features in order to diagnose it. So movement disorders in sleep, as I said, anti-Eglon5 is NREM parasomnia. How does it differ from RBD? Fine purposeful movements like manipulating an object or preparing food, in contrast to RBD, where thrashing, violent movements are seen, is a distinguishing feature. So besides this, there are a number of other antibodies associated with various sleep disorders like periodic leg movement, RBDs, etc. So tremor as an isolated presentation of immune-mediated movement disorder is rare. More often, it is seen in association with cerebellopathy or peripheral nervous system involvement, as in CIDP. So to conclude, high index of suspicion and recognition of clinical phenotypes is key to identify immune-mediated movement disorders, important for prompt immunotherapy. Unilateral symptoms without corresponding lesions on imaging may be a clue to immune-mediated encephalopathy. Typical MRI sometimes may help, but many a times the MRI features overlap with many of the other acquired disorders or genetic disorders also. So propensity to autoimmunity may another clue to the diagnosis. Like, if the patient is likely to have paraneoplastic or genetic post-infectious state, these are the clues which may help us to reach the conclusion whether it could be autoimmune or not. Increasingly, the use of monoclonal antibodies for cancer therapy is leading to increase in classic paraneoplastic antibodies or neuronal surface antibodies, or as seronegative syndrome. So new antibody detections methods are likely to further increase the number of antibodies implicated in movement disorders, and we may have more number of autoantibody associated movement disorders. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bajaj, for following the footsteps of Professor Mehndiratta. It was very well, little heavyweight, but it is what was required. It was a very interesting presentation, heavy topic, but I think you have done fully justified, you have gone beyond that. So I think my co-chairpersons are not there, so I will continue, and I invite the next speaker, Dr. Rajiv Ranjan. And or if there are any comments from the distinguished delegates or faculty, anybody wants to have? So I think we'll move on. We are short of time. So I think Dr. Rajiv Ranjan will take over and will enlighten us on the difficult practical topic, how to treat antibody-negative autoimmune encephalitis and how far to go. So I think Dr. Rajiv Ranjan will take over the proceedings.
Yes. So these are the negative cases which present like autoimmune encephalitic cases, and they constitute around 10% of all inflammatory condition of the brain. And the neural and the glial structure are so complex, and that's why there is a lot of diversity in their clinical presentation, as described by Dr. Mehndi Ratta and further by Dr. Bajaj also. In the last 10 years, there is increasing recognition of autoimmune encephalitis, which presents with the core clinical feature of infective encephalitis without fever or CSF pleocytosis. And it was noted in a noted paper, position paper in Lancet, and they said it is not realistic to include antibody status as a part of the early diagnostic criteria of the antibody-related autoimmune encephalitis. And detailed clinical evaluation is a must because of variable clinical presentation and absence of pathognomic features. How important are the antibodies? We all know GLU-N1 is very specific for NMDA receptor encephalitis, whereas GLU-N2 and GLU-R epsilon 2 have been reported in many persons and is not of any certain significance. Detection of IgM, IgA is of no significance. And NMDR encephalitis per se, 14% have antibody in CSF, but not in serum. And again, in such cases, clinical correlation is better with CSF antibodies. CSF shows lymphocytic pleocytosis in 60 to 80% of cases, and high IgG index is only in 50% of cases, and mostly, and the lowest is in the LGI1 cases. We can assess these and autoantibodies by different methods, and there are cell-based assays available. And the list is going day by day. And recently there was a paper that was showing Drebrin antibody related with the seizure cases. These are the antibodies. They are not very specific. KV1 positive, low titer GAD, ACR related antibody, PQ channel. I am just defending my case. You have to treat antibody negative encephalitic cases very aggressively. And the diagnostic criteria, Dr. Bajaj also mentioned, it was noted in position paper in Lancet recently, and they had given the diagnostic criteria for possible and the probable autoimmune encephalitis, and it was already described, and there was no note of any antibody in these diagnostic criteria. Again, in probable autoimmune encephalitis, they included the brain biopsy, but there was no description about any auto antibody measurement and their significance. If serum is positive but CSF is negative, or if the clinical feature do not fit with the antibody identified, false positive results should be considered. Some patient may present with the overlapping syndrome, pictures of NMDA and MOG, and paroxysmal DG spells. They are new clinical features which were described with VJKC related illness, and treatment decisions should rely more on clinical assessment rather than antibody titers. Imaging, they are very helpful in suspected autoimmune encephalitis. MRI, we are aware, we had seen the pictures also, and a lot of knowledge is there. Sometimes we are using PET as a supportive data in our setup also and worldwide also, although it's not standardized everywhere, but we are aware of PET changes in autoimmune encephalitic cases, and some cases where we are not having any clue, we are not having any antibody and MRI is not suggestive, clinical features are there, then we go for PET CT, and definitely we catch some pattern in PET. And acute phase, they show the hypermetabolic changes, and with the chronic phases, they show the remote areas of hypometabolism. And gradually over time, we developed a pattern recognition on FDG. And NMDA and LGI1, they present definitely different way in PET CT. And these are the two cases I am just presenting. First, this is the limbic encephalitis, and that was treated with immunotherapy, and the follow-up scan is available. And we had some data to guide us where we are going. And this is a case of NMDA related encephalitis, and you can show the hypermetabolic changes which developed and gradually regressed over time. Same patient data is there. And serology negative possible autoimmune encephalitis. Nowadays, especially after this pandemic and the COVID, we had couple of cases who presented with meningoencephalitis like presentation. CSF is suggestive of aseptic meningitis, seizure was there, confusional state was there, and MRI and other investigation were not supportive, chest CT was not supportive, and PET CT shown some atypical finding. And this is the case of LVD overlapped with autoimmune, and this is the patient which I was describing, and he had COVID in November, and that time presented with seizure, confusional state and hallucination. MRI is normal, PET is showing some changes, and CSF is COVID antibody positive repeatedly, and cells are normal, protein borderline high, and biofire is negative. Treatment depends upon the clinical evaluation and supporting investigation, which we can get through the blood investigation, CSF or MRI or PET CT. Because we have to catch early these cases, autoimmune encephalitis like cases, we have to catch early because we have to protect brain from further injury. And these cases affect different neurons and the synapses of the brain, and that's why early treatment is very helpful. Treatment modality is same. If we consider autoimmune positive or negative cases, first line treatment is steroid, IVIG, plasma exchange. Second line is rituximab and cyclophosphamide. And third line is bortezomib, which we use in cases of multiple myeloma. And tocilizumab, we had experience in the COVID time, and this also can be used in cases of autoimmune encephalitis cases. This was again taken from Annals of Neurology, a case series of 472 patients, 47% did not respond to first line. And out of 53% who didn't respond to first line, 57% who received second line therapy showed a good recovery, and 43% again did well with further treatment. For patients who were refractory to first and second line therapies, around 10%, third line treatment was considered, and a small number of patients showed improvement with intrathecal and oral methotrexate or immune adsorption techniques. In another series, 83 patients, pediatric, were treated with azathioprine methotrexate. MMF within 6 months of duration showed 7% relapse rate. Larger cohorts are needed to see the efficacy. And in few cases, electroconvulsive therapy was shown some improvement, especially in psychiatric manifestation, but this was not used as a routine practice because of some certain limitations, and because it can cause parasympathetic and sympathetic stimulation. These are the slides showing the pros and the supportive to treat autoimmune encephalitis who are antibody negative. What are the cons? We don't want to harm our patient, and we have to take very good clinical history, and the idea is to do not harm. We have to keep our mind the side effects of all possible medication which we use in our day-to-day practice, steroid and IVIG or plasma exchange and or rituximab. We have to take care of all these things. And again, in some cases, we use immunomodulatory therapy, so we have to know about the hepatotoxicity, bone marrow toxicity, mucocutaneous reaction. Monoclonal antibody can cause flu-like syndromes and the diarrhea, skin rashes, and the blood pressure changes. I'm just concluding, I'm going relatively fast, but this is a complex clinical presentation, autoimmune encephalitis, who are seronegative. And of course, this requires multidisciplinary collaborations, treatment guided by clinical symptoms and response. Raise titers without further clinical relapse is not an indicator for more immunosuppression. Residual neurological and psychiatric symptoms deficit requiring ongoing long-term management. Need for consensus guidelines for the diagnosis and management of seronegative autoimmune encephalitis is needed. And initially, everybody was showing time is brain. Now, last 10-20 decades was decade for stroke, and again this was changed to circulation is brain. I think now time has already changed, and the statement would be volume is brain. We have to protect the brain volume, and that's why we can go with proper medication. And while treating these cases, we have to take adequate care of comorbid states of patients what we are treating, and personalized medicine is very much important. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rajiv. It was a very apt presentation, and the message was loud and clear. Treat to the extent that there's no harm is done. So excellent presentation, keeping time management in time. So this is one of the best sessions where time was of prime importance to all of us. And time is brain, volume is brain, everything is brain, but time is the underlying thing. So it's an excellent job, and I must compliment you. I think this was an excellent session. we are running short of time. If organizers allow, we can have a few questions or a few comments from the distinguished gathering of faculty and delegates here. Is it allowed? I think they've gone to arrange to some necessary arrangements. So I thank you, thank everyone, including Dr. Neera Chaudhary, Professor Mehndi Ratta, Dr. V.K. Bajaj, and Dr. Rajiv for excellent presentation. And we all had a very, very extensive and elaborate, we came across very elaborate presentations, and we updated our knowledge, refreshed our knowledge, and the level of practice will definitely go up with the kind of presentation we had during this session. So I thank you all. Thanks, audience and organizers. And I'm going to close this session, and we will be starting next session